Wonderful. Hello, and thanks everyone for joining us for today's webinar from the Institute for Research on Poverty at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'm the IRP Director, Catherine Magnuson, and I'm especially pleased to be hosting this great event today. We are lucky, fortunate, and very happy to have one of our own share her important research with us today. Jessica Calarco is an associate professor in the Department of Sociology here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She is an IRP affiliate, and she has a wonderful new book, Holding It Together, How Women Became America's Safety Net. This work and book draws on over 400 hours of interviews and surveys of more than 4,000 parents in the US, and it paints a picture of the challenges that they face in trying to make ends meet and care for their children. Jess also offers policy and practice solutions that could lighten the load and relieve some of the precarity that many families face. Joining Jess, we are thrilled to have Alia Wong with us for this conversation. Alia has just begun an exciting new position as an education collaborations editor for the Associated Press. She is an award-winning journalist, and previously she worked at both The Atlantic and USA Today. We have about an hour together today, and most of that hour is going to be for Jess and Alia's conversation, but we will spend the last 15 minutes or so at the end for a live question and answer time. So I'm asking you, if you come up with a great question that you want to hear Jess or Alia answer, can you please type those questions into the Q&A box? We got a lot of questions that were submitted as people registered, and I know Alia has a good set of questions already queued up, so some of those will be covered. But we would love to hear what other questions you would like us to bring into the conversation. So please put those in the Q&A, and then as always, please feel free to participate with other comments and thoughts with us in the chat. And as I said, I've already asked you to put in who you are and where you're joining us from. So just a few more bits of housekeeping before I just hand it right over to Alia and Jess. We do have closed captions enabled, so you can toggle those on and off at the bottom of your screen as you want. And we will be posting the slides and the recording of the webinar within a day or so. And since you've registered, you'll receive a link to get to those the posting by email. And then finally, let me say this webinar is supported in part by funding from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Office of the Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation. But the views expressed by our speakers don't necessarily represent the opinions or policies of that office or of any other sponsor, including the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So with that disclaimer, I want to thank you all again for taking some time out of your day and being with us here. And just go ahead and turn it over to the stars of the next hour. Jess and Alia, please take it away.
Thank you, Catherine. Again, my name is Alia Wong. I'm an editor at the Associated Press. And, just to preface this conversation, I hear from so many women, even just in my role as an education journalist, that they feel like they're hanging on by a thread, whether they're single mothers who are just doing everything they can to give their kids decent care and a happy life, or maybe their family's breadwinners and dedicating so much energy to financially supporting their family. They tell me they are, in Jess's words, like having to fill these gaping holes in the country's social safety net. And so in some ways, I'd say like Jessica Calarco's book really explores realities that women have told me are just fundamental truths that they live through every day. But it's also really groundbreaking in its simplicity almost, right? And the way it kind of peels back the layers and examines why things are the way they are and what's needed to sort of break that cycle. So I'm just really honored and thrilled to be the host of today's conversation. And let's dig in. First question for you, Jess, is tell us about the title of your book and some of the ways in which women in the US are forced to hold it together.
Yeah, so well, first, thank you so much for hosting this conversation, to the IRP, to Catherine for the introduction, and to Alia for the questions that you brought today. I really appreciate the chance to be here and to share this book, and thanks to all of those who are in the audience as well. In terms of that title, I picked this title in part because it has multiple meanings. That on the one hand, it gets at what women are doing, that they're holding together this sort of threadbare social safety net that we have in our society and arguably our economy as well. But it also speaks to, and maybe we'll get to this when we talk a little bit more about solutions, a way that the idea that we could hold it better together, that if we think about collective solutions as opposed to more individualistic ones, that's where I kind of argue in the end that that's where we could see a path forward and a better set of solutions that aren't putting so much on each of us as individuals to sort of try to solve this crisis over and over and over again, but rather that there are ways that we could fight collectively to demand a better social safety net that would also allow all of us to kind of better collectively share and more equitably share the work that goes into, supporting our communities, supporting our families. And that's kind of where the title comes from. And it speaks to, you asked about sort of the labor that women are doing. And I think what I try to show in the book is that other countries have invested in social safety nets as a way to manage the kinds of risks and responsibility that people face in their day-to-day lives. And in the US, billionaires and big corporations have decided that they don't want to pay for those kinds of safety nets. And so they've leveraged their wealth to turn us into what I talk about in the book as a DIY society instead, where people are supposed to manage their own risks and responsibilities without really support from the government. And the idea, at least what's sold to us, is this message that if people just make good choices, they shouldn't need a safety net at all. But the reality is that we can't just DIY society. Sure, some people might be able to get by without a safety net, but there are plenty among us, including children, elderly people, people who are sick or disabled or socially marginalized, who need support from others or from institutions. And so collectively, this DIY model kind of leaves us with too much risk and responsibility for each of us to manage on our own. And so what I show in the book is that we've managed to maintain this illusion of a DIY society, essentially by relying on women to be the ones who disproportionately fill in those gaps. They're doing the work of caring for those who can't fully take care of themselves. For example, women hold almost 70% of the lowest wage jobs in the US economy, and those are disproportionately jobs in the caregiving sector, things like home health care and childcare, where also women of color and women without college degrees are doing a disproportionate share of the work as well. And on top of that underpaid labor, women are also doing roughly twice as much unpaid care work as men are. And that, again, disproportionately falls to the women who are most marginalized in our communities, in part because they don't oftentimes have the resources to outsource more help with those kinds of care. And so we can, get into the costs of all of this, but that's kind of where this title is coming from, this idea that women are holding it together, both for our economy, doing the jobs that no one else wants to do but are necessary, and also for their families and their communities in terms of filling in those gaps that, we could be supporting with safety nets instead.
Yeah, you argue that the way, and you just touched on this, that the way society is structured is broken, right? And that yet those fractures, it seems, have really persisted and even thrived. And so why is it that, that these structures have really persisted despite being so broken? And what are the historical roots of that phenomenon?
Sure. So I trace this in the book, the kind of origins of this DIY society back to the 1930s and to kind of the origins of neoliberal thought, particularly as it has manifested in the US. And essentially, in the 1930s, in the wake of the Great Depression and Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, big businesses and their sort of affiliates were looking for ways to push back against the higher taxes that were being imposed to pay for new social safety net programs. And what they found was a group of Austrian economists who were developing neoliberal theory, this idea that that societies don't actually need a social safety net and that they're actually better off without them. Because if people don't have that kind of support or protection policies in place to protect them, then they're more likely to make these good choices that will keep themselves safe from risk. And, the reality is that this theory has been widely debunked, that this isn't how people respond to risk when they're presented with it. They don't tend tend to just make better choices. If anything, it's privilege that facilitates those good choices instead. But this model is sticky. And I talk in the book about a number of myths that have been propagated as a way to make it seem as though this kind of neoliberal promise could pay off, including things around the myth of meritocracy, also gendered myths that suggest that men are sort of more suited for paid work than women are, and that women are just happier at home. And the way, and I talk about how there's a long history of particularly conservative media and conservative policymakers promoting these kinds of ideologies through think tanks, through things like General Electric Theater, which was a massively popular television program hosted by Ronald Reagan. And you can see echoes of that in continued conservative media, conservative politics, kind of think tanks, and the work that they put out today to perpetuate these kinds of ideas that kind of delude us into believing that we don't need a social safety net, and also operate to divide us by race and class and gender and politics and religion in ways that keep us focused on how we can be just a little bit better off than someone else, as opposed to how we could fight collectively to demand the kind of social safety net that we really need and deserve.
Yeah. You touched on this in earlier, but I'd love to kind of dig into the disparities that exist within these phenomena. One of your takeaways is that in many ways the realities of the DIY society cut across all races and income levels, but the consequences and the upshots of that are that this can exacerbate inequities. So talk about some of the consequences of the unequal ways these factors play out.
Absolutely. So one of the best ways to manage risk in the kind of DIY society that we've built is to dump that risk downstream, to push it onto others who are in more vulnerable positions than we are and who don't have a choice. So that's essentially what families are often doing to women. But women who are in more privileged positions in society often have the resources to leverage to outsource some of that risk. Rarely all of it. It takes a huge amount of wealth and resources to outsource all of your caregiving responsibilities and responsibilities for your own care and things along those lines. But things like childcare, things like help with home health care, things like help with, cooking meals, cleaning your home, that these are the kinds of things that women, if they have enough resources, can help to offload some of those responsibilities that might otherwise fall to themselves. And that kind of work, I mean, it's oftentimes deeply underpaid, in part because it's so labor intensive. It's not often highly profitable work, but it's often deeply necessary work to make our society function. And so for those women who are able to offload some of those responsibilities, to outsource them to others, that can make it easier for them to compete in the workforce with men, to have more egalitarian relationships with their partners, to be able to be more, to have more control over their time and their energies, to have kind of better health outcomes in the process too. But what that means, though, is that for women who are in systematically and multiply marginalized positions, those who don't have the resources not only to outsource help with care, but oftentimes don't even have support because of the way that we've systematically underinvested in and oppressed, communities of color, particularly Black and Latinx and immigrant communities in this country. The way that we've kind of stripped those communities of the resources that are available makes it hard for women to turn to others around them and ask for help. And it also means that they know that when they're struggling, even when they're struggling, it's hard for them to say no to others who might then ask them to try to hold kind of even more responsibility. I tell the story in the book of a woman that I call Patricia, who's a low-income Black. Now she's a single mom. Before the pandemic, she was married to her children's father. And at the time when the pandemic started, she was working remotely from home as a customer service rep for a health insurance company, and her husband was working in construction, and they had 3 kids. And she had taken that job, a job that she talked about as sort of demoralizing and demeaning, a job that she really hated because it was the best option that was available to her as someone without a college degree. She'd actually started a college program but dropped out because the cost got too high. But it was the best option that allowed her to work remotely, which meant she didn't have to pay for after-school care for her elementary age kids. She didn't have to figure out backup care if her toddler's child care center closed. And yet when the pandemic hit, this meant that she was, her and her husband didn't even talk about who was going to be the one to care for the kids when schools and childcare centers shut down. And this was, deeply challenging for Patricia. She talked about how, I need to not clock out mentally as a mother too when she clocks out of paid work at the end of the day. This was just, and she worried about the toll it was taking on her relationship with her kids. And so she decided during the pandemic to take a step back, just to move from 5 days a week of paid work to 4 days, because she'd actually become unexpectedly pregnant with twins during the pandemic as well. And she was just physically exhausted and stressed out. And so she was hoping to have this extra day to rest, but then her extended family finds out that she's got this day. And Patricia was one of the only people in her family who could afford a reliable vehicle. And so her family, her mother, her sister, other relatives started asking her to use that day off to drive her to the doctor, to drive them to the doctor, to drive them to the grocery store. And she talked about how she felt like she couldn't say no. She talked about how she wanted to protect that time for herself, but she knew, especially during the pandemic, that it wasn't safe for her family to be relying on, public buses, that wasn't a good option for them. And then she also felt like, what if I need help someday? And unfortunately, that's what ended up happening. The stress of the situation kind of got too much for Patricia and her husband, and they ended up splitting up during the pandemic. And in the wake of that, this was right before the twins were born. And so she needed someone to drive her around after her C-section, for example. And she had to turn to those same people that, had relied on her before. And she talked about how she was, on the one hand, kind of grateful that she hadn't said no, but also understood that the toll that this was taking on her, and talked about kind of the deep challenges that this posed for her in her day-to-day life, and how she was, talked about feeling depressed all the time and feeling kind of hopeless about what the future was going to look like for herself and for her kids as well.
Yeah, I think that's one of the most powerful aspects of the book are the human stories that you bring in that really weave everything together and really humanize, right? The realities that you're describing. Tell us about your process for researching this book and how you, as a journalist, I'm particularly interested in hearing how you found the women that you ended up interviewing. And, a lot, pretty much all of them were centered in Indiana, right? So yeah, that's, I think, where you were based at the time, right? So tell us about that decision and just some of the methodology behind your book.
Absolutely. So essentially, this project, this wasn't the book I set out to write with these data. I initially kind of envisioned this book back in 2017 after I had my own second child. I was thinking at the time about what I was thinking of as the best laid plans of parenting, how you often have these ideas about the way that you want to raise your children, and then life intervenes, whether because of structural inequalities or personal challenges that you face in your life, and you have to often grapple with this notion of what happens if I can't parent the way that I wanted to, or if I'm getting pressure from other people in my life to parent in different ways. And so to investigate those questions, I designed a study where I would follow 250 pregnant people. They all identified as women that we recruited for the study. And so I talk about them as women through prenatal clinics in Indiana, including Medicaid serving clinics and kind of more kind of clinics serving disproportionately wealthier women kind of in the state. And so I worked with a team of undergraduate and graduate research assistants to recruit these pregnant women to take this fairly extensive survey about all of the decisions they planned to make for their new babies. And then we followed up with them roughly every 6 months. So it's 6 months and 12 months and 18 months postpartum. And the first wave of the initial survey took place in 2018 and 2019. And then the follow-up surveys and in-depth interviews that we were doing with these women were still ongoing when the pandemic hit in 2020. And so and some of these women had moved away from Indiana. And so we'd already started doing Zoom interviews or phone interviews with those for whom that was easier. And so it was one of those, so we kind of fairly easily pivoted to doing all of our interviews virtually or by phone instead for those who didn't have solid internet connections. And it just became kind of deeply apparent kind of very quickly in those early pandemic interviews how much of an impact this was having on families with young children, and especially on the women within those families who were not only filling in gaps in childcare, but making sure that grandma got her medication, making sure that neighbors were taken care of when they got sick, that they had food to eat, making sure that filling in for colleagues who were dealing with challenges at home or illness and taking on extra paid work in their workplaces. And so this was kind of story after story of women filling in the gaps. And so that's where kind of the initial idea for this book came from, was sort of, and so we did an additional 3 waves of pandemic focused interviews and surveys with the moms and with their partners and with some of their social network contacts. And in part because this was an Indiana sample, I wanted to know, how are these patterns tracking with broader trends in the US? And so I did two national surveys, one through Ipsos and one through Qualtrics, in late 2020 and then early 2022, with about 2,000 parents each from across the US, to kind of get a sense of how are these patterns holding up? Are we seeing the same kinds of things even beyond this kind of Indiana sample that we have? And then with the book as a whole, trying to weave together, those different pieces of data, these deep stories that we had on these hundreds of families that we've been following for many, many years, coupled with some of the survey data, and then bringing in, some historical examples and media case studies and kind of policy stories as a way to kind of try to tell this holistic story of both, how did we get here? How did we get to this point where we are relying on women as our social safety net? And there was actually a moment where I was writing the book where, after President Biden was elected and when we had sort of Build Back Better still on the table, where I thought this was going to be like a hopeful story, like the story of how we finally learned, to take a different path. And then, as we've seen over recent months, we've not only, killed Build Back Better, but also started to strip away more and more of the protections that we had before the pandemic, and certainly dismantling some of the meager social safety net that we still have. And so it became this kind of imperative for me to try to understand, why have we consistently failed, and what is keeping us from building back better, even when we got so close so recently.
There are almost too many stories in the book to count. And I mean, you mentioned the story of Patricia. I'm curious whether there were any interview subjects or anecdotes that really just stuck with you in particular, or really just had you moved or demoralized or inspired, that really, maybe even kept you up at night after you did them. And I know you mentioned earlier that and you mentioned this in your book, that some of them lasted for hours, and I imagine were cathartic for people on both ends.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, I think the depths of the tragedy in some of these interviews were hard to those were some of the hardest interviews. There's an interview that I opened the book with a mom that I call Akari, who just experienced kind of tragedy after tragedy in her own life. She was before the pandemic, she was living with her longtime partner. They were engaged and they had 2 young children. And she had, like many of the women that we talked to, left the workforce when her kids were young, in part because she and her partner had figured out that he had a small business. It was a kind of a home maintenance kind of a business that was bringing in about $30,000 a year, and she was working in retail before they had kids, and they figured out that they would be cash negative if they started to try to pay for childcare, that they made too much money to qualify for subsidies. And so she, like many women in that situation, ended up quitting her job and becoming a stay-at-home mom. And like many of them, kind of had mixed feelings about that. But then what ended up happening, unfortunately, during the pandemic, her fiance died kind of very suddenly and tragically in the early months of the pandemic. And it was, deeply devastating for her, not only emotionally and for her 2 young kids, but also financially and logistically, in the sense that, like many women who are sort of suddenly forced into that precarity, she found herself relying on welfare. She actually was encouraged to move herself and her 2 kids into a shelter because that was the best way to improve their position on the wait list for spots for affordable housing. And so she went from, living in a fairly stable environment, not knowing anyone who was on welfare. She'd grown up in a fairly middle-class community, to suddenly having the rug taken out from under her. And so she tried to kind of get back on her feet. She started applying for jobs, in part because she was required to, in order to qualify for welfare benefits. But the job she found, especially during those early months of the pandemic, I mean, it took her months to even find a part-time job that paid minimum wage. And that was a job in retail. And, she could barely get enough hours. And so she ends up taking, another part-time retail job, and then eventually a third part-time job at a manufacturing facility, but that was a weekend job. And that was the best paying job that she had. But it meant that she had to take her kids and drop them off at her fiance's sister's house for the weekends. And so now she doesn't see her kids basically at all during the week and then at all over the weekends. And she talked about how this arrangement has just been, devastating for her and for her children. That she talked about how her daughter has PTSD from her dad's death, and that now she went from having, a stay-at-home mom and a dad who was who was there to feeling like she lost both of her parents in the wake of these kinds of tragedies. And she also talked about how the irony is that taking that third job pushed her over the benefits cliff, and that she now earns just a little bit too much money to qualify for any of the kinds of subsidized services, or paying more for some of them than she did before. And so she talked about how it would actually make more sense financially for her to quit that third job and go back on welfare, but that she knows that the clock is ticking, that there's only so many months of eligibility that she has, and that she's also not allowed to have any savings. She's not allowed to save up any money. And her parents had divorced when she was young, and her mom moved back to Japan. And so she wants to save up enough for a plane ticket to go see her mom. And that's been a challenge. And so she can't literally save up enough money to do that if she's on welfare because of the welfare rules. And so that's been something that she's kind of held out as a goal for herself. But and stories like that, in terms of just I think hers was one of the most the sort of one of the hardest stories to hear. But certainly there were others that kind of, even the day-to-day challenges of just trying to figure out childcare crises, of trying to figure out elder care responsibilities, of trying to manage sort of the sandwich generation pressures that many women talked about. I interviewed one mom who's also an academic and a professor, and she talked about how, even though her husband could do more at home, and even though her brother could do more with her mom who's dealing with Alzheimer's, that it all falls on her. And she talked about how she's like, I have a brain and I'd love to be able to use it sometimes, but I feel like it's all my energy is getting sucked into caregiving, and feeling like the institutions around her were just letting her down in the process, as well. And I think there were also stories in the book that were telling for me in terms of why women, despite the challenges that they're facing, might buy into some of the kinds of myths that we were talking a little bit about before. In part because this was an Indiana sample, a number of the mothers that we interviewed are white evangelical Christian moms, and many of them identify as Republicans or as political independents who are more conservative leaning in their politics. And some of those interviews, I think, were for me some of the most eye-opening in terms of the kinds of attitudes that they shared, the kinds of experiences they shared, and seeing how, especially, there's sort of this ironic connection in the sense that our threadbare social safety net often created the conditions that pushed them into stay-at-home motherhood in the first place. Actually, Akari's she's a Republican herself, or at least was when we first met her. And oftentimes it was this sort of lack of a social safety net that pushed women into stay-at-home motherhood. And then once they were stay-at-home moms, these moms oftentimes became deeply invested in church moms groups, which then reinforced to them that their stay-at-home motherhood was, not only good for their children, the best thing possible, but also the best thing possible for them salvation-wise, that this was the sacrifices that they were making for their children were their ticket to salvation. And this was a deeply reassuring message for moms, especially those who were struggling to make ends meet. And I talk about this one mom, April, who's a white evangelical Christian mom who found kind of deep solace in these kinds of messages from the other women in her church community, but who at the same time very much bought into these kinds of myths, this kind of meritocratic ideas, these ideas that, if people just work hard enough, even though April and her family were getting by on $30,000 a year from her husband's job as a pastor, this, to her, she still felt kind of morally superior to others who she perceived as kind of needing the social safety net in a way that, even though, she qualified for some supports and used them, but felt like her family was making these frugal choices, making these good choices, and was relying on their faith in ways that she often judged other families, particularly lower income families of color, for kind of making different choices with their own children, or kind of drawing on stereotypes, oftentimes racist and sexist stereotypes, to talk about her judgments of these other women who really needed support in a way that she herself perceived that she didn't. And she used that kind of meritocratic ideology to to justify rejecting the need for things like universal childcare, universal health care, kind of strengthening the social safety net in those kinds of ways. And so I think for me, those were sometimes some of the hardest interviews to do in terms of just hearing these ideologies that oftentimes are not the kinds of standard ways that we think about women's ideas or women's perspectives in society, but that were deeply useful as a way of understanding our current moment politically, and why we don't always see people kind of lining up to demand these better policies, even if the evidence suggests that they would be helpful in those regards.
Yeah, it was so striking to me to read about the women who rely on welfare but are philosophically opposed to it. Like a kind of undercurrent throughout the book is this tension, this sort of catch-22 that so many women experience, whether it's like they make too much for childcare or benefits, but too little to afford the basic necessities. And that in turn kind of funnels them into this trap of having to serve as the social safety net. What are like some key, whether it's policy levers or ideas or tools and strategies that can really help women break free of that trap? And I'd like for you to touch on, as part of your response, sort of, or push back on some of the sort of popular solutions that you think are misguided or counterproductive or misleading.
Yeah, I mean, so much of the messaging around, the solutions that we should use for solving problems like poverty and precarity in our society are about individual good choices. And I have a whole chapter in the book called, I don't remember the exact title offhand, maybe I should, but it's essentially the idea that like good choices don't save women. And that's, I mean, so much of the messaging is, you should just get married, you should just wait to have children, you should find the right partner, you should major in STEM, you should go to college, that these kinds of things are often held out to women as the way to protect themselves from precarity. But the problem on those fronts, and what the research consistently tells us, is that they conflate kind of correlation and causation, in the sense that the people who are best able to make those kinds of good choices are disproportionately people who are already in privileged positions. And that, just pushing people to make those choices, things like marriage, that if anything, forcing people to stay in difficult or even violent marriages is a recipe for subjecting women to violence, to abuse, to kind of mistreatment, and certainly does not reduce the chances or reduce the risks that they face in the long term, and doesn't even help children in those kinds of circumstances. If anything, kind of exposure to high levels of conflict is just as bad, if not worse, for kids than being kind of in a divorce type of situation. And so essentially what we should take away there is that, we can't put so much on the individual, and at the same time, I get why individualistic solutions are appealing. There's a reason why the self-help industry in the US is like a multi-billion-dollar industry in terms of because in the context of so much inequality and so much precarity, it's easy to want those kind of like quick fix solutions. It's easy to want to believe that you can just good choices your way out of poverty or precarity. It's what makes those kinds of, meritocratic ideas, things like what April believes, it's so sticky, because it's reassuring in the context of hardship. At the same time, I think we have to think instead about, what are the larger structures that we can change? And there, thankfully, we have lots of great models from other countries, and even from our own history of policies that have worked. During the pandemic, we put in place child tax credits that lifted millions of children instantly out of poverty. We instituted universal free lunch programs that made a huge difference for families, not only for the families in poverty who were already qualifying for those kinds of free lunches, who didn't have to face the same level of stigma around using them, but for other families who maybe could afford to pay for groceries, but for whom this became, just a little bit of lessened burden. I talked to so many moms who talked about how just not having to worry about packing their kids' lunch in the morning, not having to think about what their kids were going to eat, and that if everybody was eating it, their kids didn't complain in the same way. And so it was just this like financial and logistical and emotional boon for women that we just took away, as we decided to, or as Congress decided to. And so, there's examples of those kinds of policies, whether it's investing more in families, providing the kinds of, a sturdy social safety net broadly that would protect people from falling into poverty, that would give them more of a leg up in reaching economic opportunities, things like, access to universal childcare, access to universal paid family leave, access to free college tuition, these things like higher minimum wage laws. These are helpful for helping to make sure that people have access to opportunities in our society. And then I think there's also a piece of it about kind of ensuring that people have the time and the resources to contribute equitably to a shared project of care. And this is where things like kind of shortened work hours, like what we've seen in France, like kind of tighter mandates on the amount of paid work hours that people can engage in, help to ensure that there's a more equitable distribution of the unpaid care work that happens, or things like, guaranteed not only paid family leave, but also guaranteed vacation time, that people deserve time off to be able to take care of themselves, to be able to help take care of their families, because, there's only so much that we can outsource, that we can create these larger systems, universal health care, universal childcare, that can help people to manage these burdens and to do it in a more equitable and sustainable way that doesn't rely on exploiting those workers who are providing those services. But we can also make sure that all of us have more time and energy to, not leave the giant pile of laundry piled up in my bedroom that I have right now because I have not had time to fold it. But if we all had a little bit more time, we could do more of that labor ourselves, in addition to outsourcing it more equitably and sustainably too.
I'm an education journalist. I cover education, and so I know at least a number of the people in the audience also come from the education world. So I'm curious, what are the implications of your research for education at all levels? From early childhood to higher ed.
Yeah, gosh. I mean, I think there's so many. I think we could start on I was just talking about sort of the exploitation of labor. And certainly, I mean, childcare workers are one of the places where we see that kind of most clearly. And really, we often distinguish in the US between childcare and early childhood education. But really high quality childcare and early childhood education, there's no difference. They are all educators. And this is work that is overwhelmingly done by women and disproportionately done by women of color. And it is some of the lowest paid work in our economy. And it's, essential work not only for the children who benefit from those kinds of early socialization opportunities, but also for the families who rely on that kind of care. And I think this is a place where we could, invest so much more than we do right now, and follow the example of other countries that have led the way on those kinds of fronts, and make a difference not only for the people who provide that labor, but also for the families who benefit and the children who benefit. I talk in the book about how stigma around childcare, there's a long history of fear mongering around childcare and early childhood education. In part because, coming from conservative voices aimed at pushing women to leave the workforce and head back home. And it's a sticky set of messages. So many of the families that we talked to, that we interviewed for the project, kind of echo those kinds of fears, even if they've never known anyone and never had a bad experience themselves. They kind of perceived childcare as something that, like, you should only do if you really have to. That ideally you should either care for your kids yourself or maybe have grandma care for your kids. But the evidence suggests that high quality, center-based childcare and center-based early childhood education is a benefit for children as well. It's good for kids developmentally, it's good for kids academically and socially, and it's great for families in lowering their stress levels and helping parents to be, more attuned caregivers and more supportive during the time when they are with their kids as well. And so that's, one place where I think we could very easily start. And then when it comes to K-12 education, the gender disparities aren't quite as high as they are with early childhood education, but that's still a place where we see women's labor being devalued and exploited, in the sense that if you look at, teachers, that their salaries relative to other types of male-dominated occupations that require similar levels of education are substantially lower. And this is a case of, yes, we invest a little bit more in that. We actually treat it as a public service in a way that we often don't for early childhood education, but we don't fund it to the level where it's often sustainable. And we allow that funding to vary systematically with local tax dollars, for example, in ways that promote socioeconomic disparities and huge racial disparities in, access to resources and the kinds of supports that teachers have access to, and in ways that help to kind of amplify inequalities on those fronts as well. And then, certainly up through higher education, one of the things I was kind of consistently struck by in the interviews that we did with families was how much student loan debt is affecting even relatively high income families in the way that they are thinking about things like childcare costs, or like costs for buying a house, and how that was affecting even decisions about whether to have kids and whether to have more kids. That even moms that we talked to who were making over $100,000 a year, some of them had hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt, and were thinking about, can I really afford to have a second child right now? Because even if I'm making good money right now, so much of it is going toward paying off these debts, and I don't know what the future is going to hold, and it just feels too precarious to think about adding a second kid given the kinds of debt crises or debt burdens that we're facing. And so that's a place where making college, if not free, at least much more affordable than it is right now, and helping families to manage the debt burdens that they're currently facing, especially given how those debt burdens kind of disproportionately impact women, and especially disproportionately impact people and women of color. And like Patricia, who I mentioned before, there's also many people who started degree programs and were pushed out of college in part because of challenges with childcare or other types of challenges related to cost. And the debt burden on them is often huge in the sense that they not only have those burdens of debt, but also don't have the college degree that might then help them to get access to higher paying jobs in the future. I talk in the book about one woman who I call Brooke, who was actually never wanted to be a mom herself, in part because she'd grown up in a very kind of difficult family life situation, and like many young women, she got pregnant unexpectedly in college, and she was planning to get an abortion, but her mom, who's a deeply devout evangelical Christian, persuaded her to keep the baby, said she would help her to raise the baby, and at the time, and Brooke ended up, going along with it, and thought she'd be able to stay in college. But once the baby was born, she realized that they couldn't afford to pay for both college and childcare. And so Brooke ended up, not only dropping out of college, but also, ending up in a low-wage job, ending up on welfare. She moved into a shelter for a little while so that she wouldn't be living with her mom anymore. And it was, a deeply difficult time. And she ended up actually taking a job in childcare. That was the best job that she found available to her. And I think her story is one of those ones that just kind of illustrates this this kind of trajectory of how these kinds of burdens on so many different levels can push women into precarity and then force them into these kinds of positions where they're filling in these gaps overall.
Yeah, that story about Brooke, that one really stuck with me. Last question before we open it up to the audience, and I see so many great questions, and I of course only was able to scrape the surface. But tell us about the feedback you've gotten, and I'm really interested in hearing what the responses from men have been.
Yeah, I mean, certainly there are plenty of men who are already doing this work themselves, who are already fully invested and who understand both the unequal gendered burdens and who are doing the best that they can, in the context of the constraints. I mean, I think there's some men who will say, but like, I'm doing this too, so I should, and who are less attuned to even if they are doing a lot of this work, less attuned to the broader gender disparities or to the reasons why some men might not be able to. And there's sort of, even I've seen this both among some women and among some men, this idea that like, well, men should just step up and do more. And I think that, that there's a piece of that is very true. But I think there's also reasons to consider the way that our economy is structured. Many of the households, like I mentioned with Akari, where mothers dropped out of the workforce, where they were going to be cash negative if they paid for childcare. She was earning less than he was, and so financially, many of those families end up deciding that it makes more sense for mothers to stay home, and then that's actually becomes a sort of slippery slope with many of the dads that we talk to. That once they make those decisions, kind of sexist attitudes become appealing in a sense that they give men an out to not feel like bad guys for exploiting the labor of the women in their lives. If they can tell themselves that women are just happier at home, that kids are better off with their mother at home, then it makes those kinds of arrangements seem more justified, even if they're benefiting from the perks of those kinds of arrangements themselves. And so I think the more that we can understand that yes, some men absolutely can and should be making choices to be more active participants in this kind of labor, while also acknowledging some of the inequalities and the constraints that make it harder for some men to do so, and that make these kinds of sexist attitudes appealing for many of them in the process, I think is important. And yeah, so I think there's been a range of different responses to some, as being a woman who's fairly active online, some negative blowback on that front too, but I won't repeat those comments here. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. This was incredibly enlightening. Just when I thought I'd learned everything from your book, I feel like I got even more from this conversation. So I'll kick it back to Catherine to host the audience Q&A portion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alia and Jess. So we have time for a few more questions, and I'm pulling them largely from the Q&A. So if you're an audience member with a burning question, you still have time to go type it in there. So the first two questions I'll lump together. So there's interest in hearing more about families with special healthcare needs for their children, and then also about women who themselves might have their own special healthcare needs or disabilities, and sort of how that intersects with their roles as caregivers or and safety nets.
Yeah, those are great questions. And certainly these kinds of the burden of the burden of caregiving that comes along with, having children or caring for family members isn't a uniform burden, that there are different dimensions of social life that can lead to more challenges on that front. And certainly having children with disabilities or children with other types of special needs is a place where moms were often struggling up against, huge time burdens, huge challenges when it came to adequate childcare. I talked to one mom who's actually not in the book, but who had three young children, and the middle child was diagnosed with, or she was in the process of getting her diagnosed with possible kind of autism spectrum disorders, and was really struggling with finding adequate care for her children. She ended up dropping out of the workforce in part because she couldn't find care that would even accommodate her daughter's needs, and that it had just gotten too challenging on that front. And so that's another piece that, even in the context of subsidies, and she was in a very low income family, that not having access to those supports, having huge wait lists that they had to deal with to get diagnoses, to get access to care, especially relying on Medicaid. These were kind of incredibly huge challenges for her. And the work of that disproportionately fell to her. She actually talked about how she was the only one who can calm her daughter down when she was having a meltdown. And that even her daughter's dad, he would try to do as much as she could, but, in part because of how their family life had evolved, she had always been the primary caregiver. And so then, once those patterns were entrenched, it became kind of more and more her responsibility to navigate. And certainly, for women who were dealing with health problems themselves, there was kind of a range of different experiences on that front. For some women, this just compounded the challenges that they were facing, and certainly pushed some of them out of the workforce in ways that it just got too difficult to manage the kinds of, personal health care needs that they had. And in some cases, I talk in the book about one mom who I call Audrey, who it's a long story to get into, but in a sort of series of tragic events, she and her husband were, she's not able to use birth control because of side effects. And she ended up getting pregnant unexpectedly. In part, she had asked her husband to pull out during sex, and he didn't. And this caused a series. She, ended up being persuaded to keep the baby. And this was deeply challenging for her. She thought about leaving her husband. She thought about getting an abortion, but she ultimately decided not to because of potential blowback from her community. But she decided not to leave her husband because she didn't have access to her own health insurance, because she had lost her job during the early stages of the pandemic, and that job hadn't had healthcare anyway. And so this was, the best option available to her. And at the same time, this was, a deeply challenging decision to make. But she needed that healthcare to be able to get access to not only she had a series of ongoing health issues, but also needed mental health services in the wake of what happened with her husband and with the baby, and knew that she probably wouldn't be able to access the same quality of care if she had to kind of find care on her own. And so that was kind of one extreme of things. There were a handful of cases. There was one mom who was part of the study who developed a very serious case of long COVID and actually had a series of strokes, and ended up dealing with severe challenges. And her husband actually took over. He was the primary breadwinner before, and became not only the primary breadwinner, but her primary caregiver in the wake of kind of a series of ongoing health issues, and also the primary caregiver for their children. And he was someone who changed his mind quite severely about, gender attitudes and the way that he perceived our social safety net. And so this was a very eye-opening moment for him, but certainly something that was hard to navigate for them as a family, given that she had, previously played a role as the sort of primary person on those fronts. So definitely this is a place where the challenges are only exacerbated in the context of health challenges, and certainly amplified by our lack of investments in high quality healthcare.
Thank you. Those are some very moving stories. I want to go to a question from my friend Lucius Kulik. He appreciates your book, but he's wondering if you could say more about the important distinctions that you might have seen by race and class. And I know another question we had gotten earlier was specifically thinking about African-American women and families.
Yeah, and I think, like I mentioned with Patricia's story before, this is a place where we see, Black women in particular and other women of color more generally being disproportionately burdened, not only in terms of the underpaid care work, being disproportionately pushed into low-paying jobs in our economy, especially low-paid caregiving types of jobs, but also doing a disproportionate share of the unpaid caregiving for their families, in part because of things like rates of single motherhood, and also the disproportionate burden of, grandparents caring for, young children. I mean, this is a place where we see Black women in particular playing a vastly outsized role on many of these fronts simultaneously. And it has a lot to do with, both the stereotypes and the vilification that we have that make it easy to justify creating punitive welfare programs that force especially low-income single mothers into low-wage jobs, but also in terms of the underinvestment and the oppression and marginalization of Black communities and other communities of color, in the sense that we are, making it hard for, Patricia, for example, didn't have anyone else in her community that she could turn to rely on for support in terms of, full-time childcare, helping to navigate those burdens. And so that kind of forced her to make those choices for herself in ways that put stress on her marriage, in ways that put stress on her family relationships, and in ways that, led to ongoing mental health challenges for her as well. And so I think this is very much a place where we see the sort of history of oppression, history of racial oppression, history of racial stereotyping, and the way that that has been used to promote meritocratic ideologies as a way to sort of justify underinvestments in social safety nets, to promote this idea of people should just work harder, people should just make better choices, that those kinds of stereotypes and this sort of racialized and classed understandings of deservingness have certainly operated to amplify racial and class inequalities when it comes to the disproportionate burdens that women face.
Thank you for that. Another question. So can you talk a little bit about how this might be intersecting with the rights of women to decide what kind of family they want and when they want them, particularly thinking about Supreme Court decision around reproductive rights and dignity?
Yeah, I mean, I talk in the book about how we're seeing these attacks on reproductive freedom, arguably because the engineers of this DIY model have figured out that one of the best ways to force women into holding it together, into standing in for the social safety net, is by making them responsible for the care of young children and then leaving them with nowhere to turn for support in actually raising those children. And so if we make motherhood something that you have less choice over, if you are essentially forced into motherhood for women and anyone who can become pregnant, then in that context, as we saw with people like Akari, in terms of once she ended up on welfare, having to take the first job available to her, or as we saw with Patricia, in terms of having to take this job that allowed her to care for her kids, even though it was underpaid and demoralizing and demeaning. And so it's a way that we can, once women are responsible for caring for the well-being of others, and oftentimes that especially means children, that's a sort of easy mechanism to force them into exploitative relationships and to force them into, doing not only the underpaid work in our economy, but also the unpaid work, in the sense that, if mother, in part because of the cultural trappings that we have around motherhood in this society, women are going to be judged if their children are neglected, or if their children are not, their needs are not being met in a way that fathers never will be. And so what that means is that once women are caring for children, if they are not doing the unpaid caregiving for those children, if they're not holding up that end of the sort of responsibility stick, they can be easily penalized, easily punished. I talk in the book, I share the story of a young woman who actually first became a mother, not biologically, but by being tasked by the state with responsibility for her brother's 2 children in the wake of the opioid crisis. And this is a place where, kind of being tasked with those responsibilities pushed her out of going to college, pushed her into a low-wage job as a home healthcare provider. So this is a place where, those kinds of arrangements, the more that we can, she didn't feel like she had any other choice because she knew there was no one else to care for these 2 kids. And so this is a way that we can guilt and gaslight women into filling these roles by tasking them with caregiving and by leaving them with nowhere to turn for support in the process.
So I'm going to ask what might be an obvious question, might be a hard question. So what can we all do next, right? So we've talked a little bit about sort of big policy changes, but what do you see as just some practical next steps that all of us can think about taking to tackle these issues?
Yeah, I mean, so I talk in the conclusion of the book about how really we already know what the policy solutions are. The bigger challenge is the political will and the sort of and the ability to fight back against the engineers and profiteers of this larger system that have gotten us to this point where we are in the first place. And what I argue in the book is that what that might take is what I call a union of care, in the sense that in order to fight back, I mean, we still exist in a democracy, which means that there are more of us than there are people who are pulling the strings behind the scenes to create this system that we have. But we have these myths that are operating to delude and divide us, and divide us by race and class and gender. And if we want to reject those myths, potentially one of the best things that we can do, beyond kind of noticing that mythical thinking in ourselves and calling it out in others, is to remember how kind of care links our fates. That we all are part of caregiving relationships. We all give care to others. We all receive care from others. And when care networks break down, I just got an email the other day from a student who we were supposed to have a meeting, but she couldn't meet because her colleague had a family issue. And so she had to fill in for the colleague. And so these things have trickle-down effects. And so if we remember that care links our fates, that it affects not only the direct people involved, but all of us, and that if we're investing in networks of care, if we're investing in policies and programs that support that kind of caregiving, then it can benefit all of us and potentially help to break down the kind of mythical thinking that deludes us into focusing on how we can individually be better off in this kind of deeply unequal system, and how we can instead come together to fight for the kinds of better social policies that would arguably, at least better support us all collectively in the end.
Thank you. So any concrete next steps?
Yeah, I mean, I think concretely what that can look like is redirecting some of the energy that we're currently using to kind of judge ourselves and try to say what are we individually doing wrong and why am I failing at this, to say, how can I organize? Who can I find around me? How can I look to either existing organizations or creating organizations? Facebook moms groups are a place where women in particular spend a whole lot of time and energy. And you could use that energy to say, okay, which of us is going to run for local office? How are we going to support her in that campaign? How are we going to kind of think about the kinds of policies that we're going to advocate for? How are we going to, have people on the ground to support voting efforts? That these are the kinds of spaces and places where we could redirect some of that individualistic energy into more collective pursuits, both on the voting front and certainly in the organizing front, to support those around us as well.
Well, thank you so much for this conversation and this time. Alia, thank you for your questions and conversation. I also want to thank Judith Sears-Poisson for organizing the webinar, and Natea Taylor for helping us with the tech today. Happy it all went smoothly. And as mentioned before, we'll be posting the slides and a recording of the webinar, and we'll send out an email to folks to let them know when that is available. So I want to thank everyone for joining us, and especially Alia and Jess. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much.